angels, demons, and the mental health industry. That's coming at you today in my interview with Jeff Jones here on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Jeff Jones, welcome to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been watching you, following you for 3 months now.
Yeah,
very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you and I met at Montanica. Yeah, this conference out in Montana. Had you been there before? I was a speaker there. That was my first go at it.
Never been to Montana.
No.
Never been to anything Orthodox in terms of a conference before, ever.
Really?
So, yep.
All right. But
I was impressed to go. I knew I was going to meet somebody.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've told you that before. And that somebody's you. Because we had good conversations, we had good fellowship, and it was a really joyful time for me out there.
Yeah, for me too. So, Jeff, you're an interesting guy, and I could tell that right from the get-go. And it came through in a lot of the things that we talked about while we were in Montana. So, because I gathered, oftentimes when I share my story, it feels very twisty and turny because people who know me, they know, well, he started in art school and then he worked in the video game industry. He got into philosophy and in religion, and he's this scholar, but then he got into filmmaking and all that sort of stuff sounds really wild. Not many people go through that many twists and turns, certainly in terms of careers, interests, and things like that. But as I talked with you, I gathered that you had this art background. I gathered that you had a theology and philosophy background. I also gathered that you're in law enforcement now. Yeah. And that also there was this intersection between all of that and two other areas, one being, contemporary, psychiatric, mental health, the world, and also demonology of all things. Yes. And so needless to say, I'm very curious. I have since, learned more about your story, but in particular, I wanted to talk with you today a little bit about demonology, and then I inevitably will get into some of the other places where it intersects. But you've written a book actually on that topic. Do you happen to have a copy of it?
Right here. Yep.
Yeah. So
the title of it, this was from my editor. So they always come up with funky titles.
Yes, they changed my most recent title, and well, I won't comment on whether I like it better or not. I'll just say they changed it from what I was going to title my book.
Yeah, they always say it sells better when they come up with it. But the title of this book is Diagnosing Demons. But the book is on differentiating between evil spirits and psychological disorders, and this is actually just a revised edition of my dissertation. So
that is a great topic. Say the title again, just in case I stepped on you a little bit.
Differentiating between evil spirits and psychological disorders.
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
So give me the premise of the book, and also I know it's your doctoral dissertation, right?
Yep.
So I should have said Dr. Jeff Jones,
but a few people at the office call me Doc, but I'm just Deputy Jones.
Okay, well, but so give me, I know it's your doctoral dissertation, so give me a sense of how on earth you ended up going down, that road in terms of an area of study.
Well, it kind of goes back to where I started in school at Liberty University. I think I told you that I was involved in a certain cults, witnessing to certain cults that had come to town. One of them was Anton LaVey's daughter. Mm-hmm. She had come to town. And
for people who don't know who Anton LaVey is.
Well, so he wrote the Satanic Bible.
Yes, that's
Satanic verses. Yeah. And So I'll just tell a little bit about that story, and because it all of it leads up to the writing of my book.
Yes, please. I'm all ears.
Yeah. So we were witnessing these people out on Ward's Road. They were going to Thomas Road Baptist Church. Yes, they were going to Thomas Road Baptist Church.
Okay.
And I guess, I don't know why, but I guess they thought they were going to take down Dr. Falwell for some reason. Well, anyway, one thing led to another.
This is the Jerry Falwell? Is this
the Jerry Falwell at the height of his moral majority? So this was this is 87. This is 1987.
Okay, moral majority, Jerry Falwell, Satanists go into his church in order to try to take him down. All right. Yeah. This is a good setup.
But also the whole culture, the culture of Satanism was very popular. You had all these guys on tour talking about Satanism, satanic rock music, running your records backward to hear the secret message. And if you get Led Zeppelin out, you'll hear Hail Satan, stuff like that. And so it was on trend. It was very in vogue. Even the criminal law enforcement were now getting involved because they were finding places, crime scenes that appeared to be maybe some rituals going on. So I remember reading that literature. Anyway, one thing led to another. I ended up in Denver, Colorado at one of Bob Larson's seminars. And it was packed. It was a full house, 500-600 people. And he had 4 Satanists on the panel. One of them was one of the rock and rollers. One of them was more of the Anton LaVey type, the philosophical Satanist. The third one was she was into generational Satanism. So this was the family. This is the history of the family going back, in her case, 200 years. So that was a pretty interesting story from her. I forgot what the fourth one was, but the whole seminar, I'm sitting on the second row. This woman keeps looking over at me, and I'm feeling kind of nervous because she's staring me down. And after the conference was over, she came right over to me and said, "I need to talk to you." And I said, "Okay, I'm listening." And she said, "I need you to talk to my daughter." And I said, "Are you sure you're talking to me? I mean, there's 100 other people here, and I don't even know who your daughter is." And she says she's that girl up on stage, and it was the girl in generational Satanism. So I'm getting nervous now. So I spent the evening with her listening to her story. I stayed up all night listening to her story, and she invited me back. Her family invited me back, and they lived in Boulder, Colorado, which at that time was probably the New Age capital of America. I mean, that's where Colorado State University is. It was a really weird visit. I won't discuss the visit. There were some moments where things that don't occur in your life convince you of the supernatural that were happening to me, like friends of mine waking up in Cambodia, wanting to know what's going on and praying at the exact time I'm landing at the airport, stuff like that. Well, anyway, Sarah, she's the one that convinced me to go down this route. Okay. And so I still have her letter that she wrote me on May 12th, 1988. I'm going to read it, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm all ears.
Right. Yep. She said, I pulled out your last letter and talked about your peers thinking Satan is just a bag of air. Because I was going back home talking about all this with my peers at school at Liberty. They didn't believe a word I was saying. And I was telling them about Sarah's story. And she said, "Here's a little advice from me, who knows what it feels like. Explain to them that obviously God has different callings for different people. And that ministry is definitely not for everyone. This ministry is definitely not for everyone, but this is what the Lord has led you to do. And you simply are following his orders. As for Satan being a bag of air, perhaps they have only read the cheerful sections of the Bible and conveniently skipped over the references to Satan and his works on this earth. But nonetheless, Don't let it get you discouraged. If you know in your heart that you're doing what God has called you to do, and everything else will eventually fall in place. That's what kick-started this whole thing. That time with Sarah. Now her family, I won't go into her story because it's a tragic story, and it was tragic. It was also revealing. It was heartbreaking, and it's everywhere.
Okay. So I'm totally fine with protect anybody's privacy you want, but can you give me a sense? When you started describing this thing you went to, and you're talking about like the philosophical Satanist, right?
Yeah.
I presumed these folks were these former Satanists or current Satanists? Because when you describe somebody who was generational Satanist, it sounds like, who's talking about 200 years of, tradition, satanic tradition within their family. I would presume that person was actually currently still embedded in that. But obviously that sort of letter sounds like he wasn't. So what can you tell us?
She, her and her mother had gotten out.
Okay.
Her brother was still in. So he wasn't at the house at the time I was there.
Okay.
And so she was out. She was actually, I don't know if you remember Sean Sellers. He was an individual who got involved in Satanism and murdered his mother and father and a couple other people. I know this
story, yes.
And he was on death row in the 90s. But she was visiting him in Oklahoma at the prison at the time. So she was starting a ministry to reaching out to these people. But she was out of it. And as far as I know today, she's still out of it. So
okay. Well, could you talk, maybe without talking specifically about her story, for folks who have no exposure to Satanism, right? Like all they've ever heard of is like they've heard pop culture. They've maybe seen images related to, heavy metal. They've heard some people say, oh, that's a bunch of bunk. They've heard other people say, no, it's real, whatever. For somebody, like her, not necessarily that you have to share her story, but for somebody who, has genuine, real history, generational Satanism, what does that actually look like? Since, plenty of people have no clue what's true, what's false, what's real, what's not. Can you give us some sort of sense in broad brushstrokes what that looks like?
Well, there's no way I could verify all of her stories.
Sure.
Particularly that time. I probably could today because of the tools of the internet and because I worked in investigations for 4 years. But you can think of it like a family who's been at a certain church for 100 years and just passes down from family to family. It's usually the head of the household who is the primary. They meet at certain places. They do certain things, and it all revolves around a form of Satanism that involves child sacrifice. It involves all the things that are probably out now in our culture. You just got to know where to see it and how to look for it. Because I think it's everywhere.
Okay.
So, it could be like, the thing with P. Diddy right now. It's going to sink into a hole and get revealed that there were a lot of children behind this. There's a lot of stuff going on in the whole industry, all the industries, political, musical, film, that goes directly to the type of stuff Sarah was talking about in the 80s. So it wasn't out then, but it's out now.
So in terms of that sort of stuff, obviously you're hinting at, like pedophilia, sacrifice, blood rituals, things like that.
Yeah.
Obviously there's been any number of folks who have tried to popularize the idea that says, look, yeah, sure, there's a certain contingent of Satanism that actually believes in demons, but for many of us, Satan is just a philosophical, symbolic figure of rebellion and self-actualization and so on. And the sorts of things that you're talking about with like the sort of generational Satanism, how true or false is that?
It's true.
Okay.
So the philosophical types you were talking about, that's Anton LaVey.
Yeah.
And Colonel Michael Aquino, if you ever heard of him. Mm-hmm. He was high up in the military. And I'll tell you a story. You mentioned to me earlier when we were talking about energies. I was in the library when I got back from Denver, and they actually had a copy of the Satanic Bible in the library. So when I picked it up, I had to drop it because I couldn't take the energy, whatever that means. But I remember you asking me stuff like that, and stuff like that was happening all the time. I just couldn't explain it. I didn't know what it was, but even in my dealings in law enforcement, I got stories similar to that too. So, but yeah, Anton LaVey, that's the philosophical Satanist. Do what thou wilt is the sum of the law. Right. It goes back to Aleister Crowley. Crowley was involved in a different form of Satanism that has probably to do with more what we were talking about in terms of Hollywood politicians, stuff like that. It filters down through the Masonic lodges and stuff like that. So a quick story about the Masonic lodge. You want to hear it?
Sure. So I'm all ears.
So I got out of seminary. I went to Southeastern in '93. My first church was in Burlington, North Carolina. And the pastor there had a mental breakdown and he had to leave. So I'm the associate pastor. I get to preach because that's what I had to do. And we had a treasurer there because they'll buy you books. So I was doing a sermon series and I said, I told the guy, I said, here's the books I want. And I actually had an original copy. I love original copies of source material that an old guy way out in the country had given me. And it was about this thick. And it was on the Masonic rituals. And so I remember the day they called me. I was working with the youth or something. They called me up and they said, we got to let you go. You're fired. I said, with no severance pay? What am I fired for? Well, they gave me a bogus thing. But I talked to a lady the next day on why they fired me. And she said, were you getting ready to preach a sermon series on the Masons? And I said, yeah. She said, you didn't know that half our congregation are Masons? And I said, no, I did not. She says, well, that's why you were gone. So that's my Masonic story. But I got one right across the street from the house, too.
Yeah, there was one. There was one where I lived in Kentucky. Actually, a former one, but anyway, that's another story.
For anybody listening, I'll just say this: that could be a deep dive. If you want to explore that world, go down it because you'll find plenty of stuff. Because that book that I had said that the god of the Masons is Lucifer. So this was from a 33rd degree Mason. So that's what I was just going to tell everybody. Like, hey, did you know that this is this? And like, well, so.
Yeah. So now I want to go back to my question, then I want to get back to your story. Okay. So my question, I was really sort of pressing this whole thing of these sort of generational Satanists, this type of satanic family that you're talking about there. Mm-hmm. Did you say her name was Sarah?
Sarah.
Yeah. That she was part of. I asked whether it was philosophical, whether Satan was seen as a real figure or not. And you did affirm that, that it's not a lie, right? It's not a falsehood that the philosophical Satanists do tend to see Satan as a mere symbol as opposed to an actual figure and so on. Yeah. And yet everything you said seems to indicate that despite them treating Satan in that way, there's still this dark satanic energy that comes with it.
Exactly.
Can you flesh that out for me and for our listeners?
Well, in Sarah's case, it wasn't a philosophy for her. It was a real entity, real beings that were involved. I mean, she talked about certain demonic names. She remembered the ritual that she had to go through as a child. So they didn't believe in the satanic verses. That she probably would laugh at that. She Yeah, she probably would. She lived through this experience through rituals, and she had the scars to prove it. And by God's grace, she got out with her mother. And it's like I was going back to Liberty. I was telling them the story, and they were like laughing me off.
So it is a mixed bag where, some folks do go ahead and embrace this sort of philosophical Satanism, and they don't really believe that these are real entities. And then other people, recognize, no, there's actual beings attached to these symbols, and they go deeper into the actual spiritual side of it.
Yeah. Especially when they have names associated with the demons. So
yeah. There's a lot in the Old Testament about that, and why you're not supposed to say those names, because they're attached to real things. All right, so keep on going down this road, because we started down this to hear Sarah's story, because we wanted to hear how you ended up writing this book and going down the road that you went down.
So that was late 80s, 90s. So I want to just jump ahead, because the 90s is when I got married and started having children. I started my PhD program, just doing my coursework, and I knew I was going to write on the subject. So I spent a lot of time that's when I hammered down on my research, but it was really interesting because my professor, Dr. Philip Captain at Liberty University, God rest his soul, he was a psychology professor, and he was an original thinker. He's kind of like you. You sit down and start listening. You just want to listen for a while, because eventually he's going to say something that a light goes off. Well, I was taking abnormal psychology with him, and he just paused right in the middle of class, and he said, "Put your notebooks away. We're going to talk about demons for 2 weeks." And he started telling, just how his ideas about how demons work in the mental health system. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to take his work and do research to it, refine it, put clarity on it, because he was in the cutting edge of his work. He got fired for it eventually. So
fired from Liberty?
Yeah. For his work. Because you know how universities, they got to get accredited. And if you're writing original stuff and you're not going to use their sources, then it's bye-bye to you. Yeah. And so that's how all of this evolved with the book, in terms of what the content of this book is. So that was probably, I don't know, maybe the mid 2000s because I had gotten out for a while, because I had 5 kids, so you got to raise your kids. Yeah. And that's how I just started writing this book. I mean, if that answers your question. So, yeah.
So give us, give folks, if you could, sort of an abstract, what's the main thesis of it, just to give them a sense of what you're arguing in there, and some of the things that you cover.
So if you don't mind, I'll probably just read some stuff.
Yeah, I don't mind at all.
I mean, one of the main theses is psychological disorders are not a disease one catches, but they're a form of hell they create for themselves.
So it's very orthodox. No wonder you became orthodox.
Yeah, I'll tell you how that happened too. So, as a dissertation, you got to do your introduction, and you got to do your chapter 2 on. You got to study everyone else's stuff. Right. You got to do the literature review. So, but I said it up front that this book addresses how various approaches concerning the issue of mental illness and how their different philosophical orientations led to different conclusions about the cause of psychological disorders. So that's a true statement. It's the thesis of this study that a Christian position on psychological disorders should be grounded on certain biblical presuppositions regarding human nature, and that the rise of scientism has contributed to a situation in which there's now distinct difference between the two as the specific cause of these disorders. Moreover, Christians have a special interest in developing their understanding of human persons and the cause of psychological disorders, while recognizing that we are involved in a spiritual struggle and that we are opposed by powerful spiritual forces outside of our empirical senses. The variations among Christian positions on the issue may be consistently explained by the variations in their underlying theological positions on the nature of the human person, particularly their view on how these spiritual forces either cause psychological disorders or how they correlate with them. So the crux of the research was correlation or causation. So when I was doing a review of the literature, the Christian literature, let me just show you some of the things. Counseling and the demonic.
Okay.
I just went upstairs and grabbed books. I got a whole shelf of this stuff.
Okay.
Demon Possession by John Warwick Montgomery. Here we go. Remember Pigs in the Parlor? When Pigs Move In. Pigs in the Parlor was a very popular charismatic writing back in the early 80s.
Okay.
Now we come along, Uncovering the Mystery of Multiple Personality Disorders. I mean, this stuff was being cranked out.
Okay.
And so I found, because I had to go to the library and I had to get peer reviewed stuff.
Right.
I couldn't write a dissertation on when the pigs move in. So I found a few well-written research papers from certain authors that were actually discussing what I was trying to say about causation and correlation, right? And every one of them that was discussing the state of mental illness and psychological disorders and evil spirits, however you want to frame them, it always was a component of causation. And I'm like, okay, well, my thesis is it's a correlation. It's not a causation. Demons don't make you do anything, because later on in the book I talk about free will. And but my question was, well, if they correlate, how do they correlate? In what way do they correlate? And at the same time, I'm interacting with the whole mental health system, all of their writings, because by that time, even in the mid-90s, it was all straight up chemical imbalances.
Right.
Just read the literature. It's all chemical imbalances. And it even showed in the shift in the DSM-V. I think we talked about it. The DSM-1 or 2, homosexuality was a behavioral disorder. Now it's not. So their Bible switches a lot. It's gone from this big, if you read the first one, to about that thick.
Right.
So that's what I was doing with the basics of the research. Got any questions so far?
No, keep on cooking.
Okay.
I'll jump in if I've got one.
Okay. All right. So that's what chapter 1 is, the problem to be addressed. Let's see. Here's a quote I wanted to say from Nancy Anderson, because this is their view. The modern scientists of today, even that nomenclature seems too vague. The trend presently moves towards seeing psychology in terms of brain functioning, physiological changes, and chemical imbalances. Nancy Anderson writes, the major psychiatric illnesses today are diseases. They should be considered medical illnesses just as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. So there you have it. Mental illness is a disease that people catch.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to sort of bring this down for certain folks, I think there's a few different patterns here, right? Which one of the complaints, that I've had with regard to psychiatric mental health industry is that on the one hand, there's several that I have, right? The one is that it postures itself as a science. And in this sense, even if, there might be a suppressed clause of soft science, right, it still tends to poise itself as if it's a hard science, as if it's dealing in hard concrete data. And some of the data is and some of it isn't. But the problem is what ends up smuggled in is that there actually is a heavily values-based, worldview-based assessment. So when you're dealing with what's healthy and unhealthy in psychology, you're actually in the psychiatric world, you're moving into territory that is overt worldview. So on the one hand, in the empirical sciences, like, if you're talking about, optometry, it's easy enough to say, look, everybody understands that what an eye is this organ that's meant to provide sight. And we all understand from experience when it's working well and when it's not, and so it's pretty easy to talk about whether an eye is experiencing some sort of breakdown that's hindering it performing that function and when it's not. So the word healthy and unhealthy is relatively uncontroversial when talking about something like optics. But once you get into, the soul, when you're getting into psychiatry and you're starting to talk about the soul, you actually now are in overtly worldview metaphysical territory on multiple fronts. Multiple fronts, right? Because one of them is just saying, when you're saying, well, that's healthy or that's unhealthy, when you're talking behaviorally or something like that, when you're talking about how you live, you've actually moved into the territory of basically philosophy and religion. You have to actually weigh into the question of what is man? Why are we here? Is there a why at all? Is there any meaning? If so, what is the teleological end, right? The purpose or end of man? And you have to begin to offer these sorts of assessments, which are really very deep and rich worldview assessments. They go to all the things that philosophy and religion address, whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's common nature, so realism versus nominalism, how you discern, right, the connection between common natures and the good. Is it natural law? Is it divine command? Is it something else? Is there a connection? Is there not? You're moved into the realm of morality, and whether or not morality is just pleasure and pain. You've moved into the territory of whether those, what the sort of structure of morality is. Is it related to the teleological ends of things like a natural law or not? And so on and so forth, right? In other words, the very simple phrase like, well, that's not a very healthy behavior, or that's not a healthy approach to relationships, or that's not a healthy train of thought, or whatever. It sounds so benign when coming from somebody in psychiatry. And oftentimes people in psychiatry will talk as if they're worldview neutral, right? Like, I'm not here to tell you, whether or not there's a God or what the meaning of life is or things like that. And they'll try to, in some ways, distance themselves from the metaphysical issue. But the problem is there is absolutely no way to make a true assessment, to make an objective assessment about the sorts of issues that psychiatry deals in, what's healthy and what's unhealthy, without wading into the territory of philosophy and religion. So it absolutely cannot be worldview neutral. So that's one thing.
Exactly.
The other thing, which I'm hearing you're touching on, is it goes into the territory of the question of whether or not we have a soul, whether we have free will, and whether there's an invisible world that affects us. Because those things are really, really important. And this is, I think, when you talk about correlation versus causation, the fact of the matter is the empirical stuff we can observe has to do with, basically the physical fleshly stuff. It's the stuff you can look at, poke and prod, things like that. And so part of the question you run into is, yes, we might notice that there's a chemical shift that happens in the brain, or we might notice a certain activity here in the brain when this is going on. But the question is there something non-empirical, inaccessible, that is causally prompting that? Or is that thing the prompt? Is that the cause? And again, that goes into the realm of metaphysics. But the problem is, because of the desire for psychiatry to be an empirical science that is a hard science, it has a tendency toward physicalism. It has a tendency to have a reductionistic materialist view, where it presumes that the chemical is not a imprint of something invisible, right? It has the presumption that the chemical, and whether it's balanced or imbalanced, whether it's a healthy level or not, it has a presumption that that's actually the cause, in which case the problem you run into is the issue of, several different issues. One of those is whether or not you can actually address the underlying cause by just addressing the chemical, right? And that's because you have to answer that question. Is the chemical reacting to something else so that it is an effect, not a cause? Or is it the underlying cause? So much of, sort of chemical treatment tends to treat it as the cause rather than the effect. Yep. But the fact of the matter is, for some of us, we may be depressed, for example, have a chemical imbalance that results because of choices that we're making. It may be that we are actually depressed because the way we're living is depressing. That we're going down a certain road that's your body. What you're seeing is the effect where your body is actually telling you we are not living the life we ought to live. We're not living toward, the end to which we were created. We're not living in the way we were created to be. And that's there as a signal. Just like if I cut my arm, that's a signal to my mind to say, hey, by the way, we're hurt, we're injured, there's something needs to be addressed. And so the problem you run into is the question you face is, are some of these, things that we experience, like certain depression, certain forms of depression or something like that, are those caused by like chemical imbalances, or are those a symptom of the fact that my body is designed to tell me when I'm not living the way I ought to live, when it's hurt, right? Just like with when I'm cut. And so the problem is that oftentimes with this sort of materialist approach, you come in and you try to balance out the chemical in order to say like, okay, there we go, we've addressed the problem. But that's like coming along and saying, well, I see that you have a gash in your arm. I see it's causing you pain. Let's give you a numbing agent so you don't feel it anymore and not address the wound.
Exactly.
Right. And so, but that's exactly it. And then you're adding to that the additional layer, which says, that's just on a basic level. You could say all the things that I just said as a Stoic, right? You wouldn't even have to be a Christian. You could just say it because as a Stoic, you would believe that you actually do have a soul. As a Stoic, you would believe you have free choices. As a Stoic, you would differentiate these sort of free capacities of the rational soul from the animal passions of the body and things like that. And so you would get into that very same territory. But of course, with Christians, and not just Christians, let's not pretend Christians are the only people who ever believed in angels and demons and spirits that affect us. But you're adding the additional layer of whether or not there's also this other invisible world that's also a potential causal agent within the mix. So that goes to a lot of the issues that I actually have with the psychiatric industry and enterprise. Now, before I kick it back over to you, I will say this. I think there's oftentimes a false dichotomy that happens, and I'd be curious your take on this. I think there's oftentimes a false dichotomy where folks who are very pro psychiatry and psychology would hear the sort of thing I would say, and they'd be scandalized because they think, well, there's people who just are born with mental disorders, and you're suggesting that they should just try harder and deal with it and so on. And so they end up in this sort of false dichotomy where it's either choice or it's medication, and there's no room ever for, sort of medication or something like that. Or on the other side, again, the same thing where folks on the spiritual side, right, who are advocates of free will and believe in the spiritual realm would say the same thing, but they would say it positively. Yeah, that's right. And I will say, I think that's, for my part, I think that's actually a false dichotomy. And I could point to the church fathers on this if you're curious. But the fact of the matter is, like, yes, we do believe that we are in a fallen world. So the Christian worldview grants that some people are born with deformed limbs, right? Yeah. And, things that just don't work. Some people are born blind. That organ doesn't work. And so it's not as if there's never something that goes wrong in an organ such as the brain, right? It's not as if it's anathema to, in some ways, try to treat that. Right. Just like, if your eyes are going, there's nothing wrong with trying to treat the organ of your eyes. But the fact of the matter is, I think the proper sort of Christian perspective is that it's a two-way street. Yes, my body can affect my mind. That's why I can take drugs and it'll end up, affecting my mental state. But at the same time, my mental state can affect my body. So certain patterns of behavior begin to imprint themselves on their body. So I think the proper view is not the false dichotomy that says there's either chemicals or there's spirit, and ne'er the two shall meet. I think the actual true historical view is that it's a bilateral relationship. Exactly. The soul affects the body and the body affects the soul. So to whatever extent, if you are going to, for example, explore whether or not a certain, drug related to chemical imbalances is suitable, you have to also pair it with the question of, well, what is the soul doing? What are the patterns of behavior, right? It's a two-way street, just like in my gouged arm, analogy. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead and put the numbing agent in so that I don't feel it, but you've got to address the gouge, right? It's got to be both. So anyway, that's sort of how I've tended to come down on it. Am I,
No, I agree with that. I asked a doctor one time, he was a psychiatrist. I said, are mental states physical? He went, are mental states physical? He said, no. I said, you're right. I said, that's the correct answer, doc.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, well, what if I get into a car wreck and I have brain damage? Will that affect my mental state? If my brain is not working right, just like your arm could be cut off or whatever. He goes, yeah, that can affect your mental state on how your brain actually, and we see this all over the place. I mean, Down syndrome kids, idiot savants, something's wrong with their body that their soul cannot process a fully formed human life, right? What we would consider normal. But in terms of take the addicts, because I deal with a lot of just people and I don't care if it's street drugs or legal drugs.
Okay,
it's all drugs. Mm-hmm. It's all a numbing agent.
Right.
Even the alcoholic, it's a numbing agent. But even them, they're fighting for something. They're fighting for their life, but they don't know how to get out of it. And every time, we might get into this in a little while when I talk about work. There's a process in our culture right now that deals with them efficiently, effectively, and it's nothing but bondage. It's just the same type of bondage they've been in, and they're looking for a way out.
Right. Yeah.
And when you talk to these people, so there's a difference when I talk to the PhDs and the MDs and all that versus the guys at the jail. They all know this stuff. You can just have a casual conversation with them. Like one thing I did when I was in the jail was I did a research study on the inmates. So I just take 100 guys. Hey, do y'all hear voices? Every one of them. Oh yeah, we hear voices. Well, how do you calm them? Well, they don't know how to do that. They don't know how to but they're all saying they hear voices in their head. So I classified the voices as egosyntonic or ego alien. So there's a voice that's inside your head, right? Like when you're talking to yourself but then there's the ego alien voices. Those are the psychotics. There's the voice outside your head. They're looking up at the corner of the ceiling, talking to something, right? And this is even after they've come out of their drug-induced psychosis. So they've been in for a minute. So they're not high anymore, but they're still hallucinating. They're still talking to something up there in the corner. So I'm taking notes, right? And then I'm seeing how many are like this when they come in a drug-induced psychosis. And then I'll just talk to them about what's going on in their minds. So, but yeah, you're right about everything you just said. It's a both and. It's not an either or.
Yeah. Well, I remember there's an article, I'd have to dig it up. I'm sure I have a copy here someplace, but I remember stumbling on an article in Early Christian Studies, Journal of Early Christian Studies, I think it was, which was talking about this exact thing with regard to the demons, which should be no surprise, but that, you have this sort of this conception in modern lore, I'll call it, about demonology based on sort of Hollywood versions of demons, where demons always just, they sort of puppeteer, they enter in, they possess, things like that, right? That type of thing, right?
Yeah.
But what's interesting is, and what's also interesting is that with that, there's a presumption that obviously early ancient peoples must have believed that there was no physical causes of disease like epilepsy. It's just demons sort of shaking you and throwing you down. And so they presume that that's what's going on in the New Testament, since Jesus heals epileptics, for example. But one of the things that's interesting is when you actually trace the church fathers, they did not believe that. The church fathers believed that, they thought it was like some sort of problem in the lymph nodes or something like that. So they would grant that there was some sort of physical cause related to epilepsy, that there actually was some sort of physical disorder. But they presumed that just like everything else, what the demons do is they take advantage of and exacerbate wherever you're weak. In other words, you're in a fight, right? And you're in a fight with somebody who doesn't care about rules. Right. Yeah. They're looking to take you down and play dirty. They don't care. So if you've got, a bum hip, they're going to pound away on that bum hip as much as they can, because that's all they care about. They're not going to avoid shots to the groin because that's against the rules or something like that, or eye gouging or whatever it is. They're going to work with whatever they've got. And so if you've got some sort of imbalance, right, that inclines you toward epilepsy, that's where they're going to attack you. And so the church fathers, what was interesting is, unlike the caricature where people today scientifically minded people today, right? Quote unquote, scientifically minded people today presume that ancient man had no concept of certain disorders being physical in nature. And therefore they accuse ancient man of having this sort of dichotomy where it's like, that was demonic, not physical. This was physical, not demonic, something like that. In fact, the ancient world had a much more nuanced view where they presumed it was bilateral. They presumed, just like with the body, right, that my body assails my mind, which they thought was ultimately a material spirit, assails my mind with the animal passions and things like that. But my mind can also redirect, say no to, reshape my body through the choices it makes. And so they thought it was with regard to the demonic. Somebody who struggles with epilepsy, they thought there was a physical component to what epilepsy was, and that it's a genuine disorder that's marked on the person because of the fall. It's a corruption like any other. But they presumed that the demons intentionally attack that person on that front and exacerbate the issue. And that's why Christ can cast out the demon and heal the person of epilepsy. He can do both because there's two things going on, a physical thing and a spiritual thing going on. So anyway, I find it fascinating that actually is the more ancient view. Yeah, what do you got for me?
This is chapter 4, the story of the epileptic boy.
Okay, go for it.
Well, no, I was just going to point it out because it's too long to read.
Okay.
But it just said everything you just said.
All right.
But I left the question open. So what I did with my case studies, the epileptic boy, the woman who was bent over, King Saul, the demonic Gadarene. What I did is I just took, I compared the text or the story with the DSM. So could the DSM come up with all the symptoms that this person was experiencing? Because here's the thing. No one case has the same thing going on. You just can't do it. Everyone's different. Even today, when I talk to people, no two cases are alike. You can't just pigeonhole them and say, okay, well, that's this. like the mental health system does, because all they do is drag you in, give you a label, give you a pill, and kick you out. But anyway.
That's actually one of the things that I had noted, that, what's interesting is when you're talking about a corruption, we tend to try to organize corruptions and disease and make them in some ways uniform as if they're a common nature.
Yeah.
But they're privative in nature. They're distortions, right? So when it comes to, for example, a circle, here I'm speaking as a realist, as you know, there is one right way to draw a circle. There are an infinite number of ways to distort it.
Yeah.
And those are not moving toward alternative forms, right? They're just distortions. But it is interesting that, and I understand why this is, right? We can try to identify certain patterns of corruption so that we know, certain patterns that might help address it and things like that. But there is almost a tendency with the naming that happens of different diseases and psychological states to treat them as if they're a form, as if they should be perfectly uniform the way a well-formed eye would be perfect uniform. But they can't be, because they're distortions, they're divergences.
Yes.
So at best, what you can do is identify a certain broad pattern of divergence that's there. But the idea that it would somehow be uniform is, it wouldn't be. Metaphysically, it wouldn't be.
No, it can't be.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I want to touch on, and I don't want to lose track of your book or any of these sorts of things. I want to hear more about some of the stories that you've experienced and things like that. But let's pick one particular sort of popular, I think, case study. Let's say it's probably not really a case study, but an example that in the popular mind, cultural mind, raises the very sorts of questions, dichotomous questions we're talking about spiritual or physical, which is sleep paralysis. So I'll set it up for the audience, and then I'll kick it over to you before I share my thoughts. But, so for anybody who doesn't know, sleep paralysis is this phenomena where a person, wakes up and yet they can't move, can't speak, but they begin to see things, and they begin to see certain patterns, certain shadow people, shadow people with red eyes. Sometimes those shadow people speak, right? Those sorts of things. And it's very oppressive. It's very dark. It's very traumatic. Many of the reports include seeing the same types of things, right? There's the Hat Man as one that shows up regularly. And that. And they have this experience until until it goes away, and then they regain their faculties and things like that. And obviously there are plenty of Christians and folks who believe in the spiritual realm who are like, that's demonic, right? Like, what you're seeing is demons. But of course, the more scientifically minded folks, meaning people, I always put that in scare quotes, because I think if you understand what science is, there is not a dichotomy between science and religion. Scientifically minded typically means that you treat science as the be all end all of knowledge. You have a reductionistic materialist view where you only believe it. You're an empiricist who only believes in what you can poke and prod, and all of that sort of stuff. So the contemporary scientifically minded person is then inherently skeptical because they don't believe in the spiritual realm. And they tend to offer an explanation of that. That's a purely chemical, scientific, here's the dream state that you're in, and so on. So with something like that, I mean, what is your disposition? What is your take on something like that? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? Is it both?
No, it's both. Okay. I mean, it's my physical body who's experiencing it. So it's physical for me, because it's happened to me. I mean, I've talked to people. I got people in my parish it's happened to, and I don't know them from Adam. They just tell me the story, and I'm like, that happened to you too?
Yeah, I've met a lot of people. I've cataloged a lot of my own stories. Plus, there's also a documentary called The Nightmare that catalogs a bunch of these. But go ahead.
And you can see them in the films. That go look at Emily Rose's story, the possession of Emily Rose, see how that started. So the same thing. Mine happened when I was 10. So that was kind of scary for me because I didn't know what was going on.
I believe
at the time. I probably probably not should have written a paper on ESP at 10. So
is that what occasioned it?
Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking back, but no, I was in my bed and I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't talk, couldn't move, and this shadow walks right down the hall and stands right next to my bed. And that was 51 years ago, but I can remember it like it was yesterday. And it was, time stops too. That's the thing. When you go to, like, when you're sleeping, time stops. You don't know what's going on when you're sleeping. But I know I was fully awake, because when I let that scream out, when I finally got the release, Mom and Dad were in there in a second, because I screamed. It was a curdling scream. So I had the experience of that. Now people can flop it off whatever they want, but you and I got too many people we know that have gone through the same thing.
So what, let's pretend I was a skeptic. What sort of thing would you point to say, the physical side of it is obviously real, like your body can't move and things like that. But what is it that leads you to believe that it has a spiritual component to it?
Well, at the time, I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But that would go back to my presuppositions and my faith, my worldview. It goes back to your worldview. I tell these doctors all the time, even where I work, when we take someone to the hospital, I said, your whole worldview is based on faith. One doctor said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, how do you determine if someone's got a chemical imbalance? You open up the DSM and just say, here are the symptoms. Here's the label. How do you know they got a chemical imbalance? The only way you can test for a chemical imbalance is to do a spinal tap. Are you doing spinal taps on all these people? No. I said, well, you're just guessing then. So they don't like to admit it, that they have a faith system that they believe in. And I can't prove that I had that experience happen, except that I know it happened. And that's just, they're the same way when you get down to brass tacks and the discussion. But what they like to do is they like to loom their doctorates over you. I'm the medical doctor. You're not a medical doctor. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. No, I do know that is a real challenge with the, I do think there is a sort of false appeal to authority. And here I'm using that in the sort of fallacious, it's logical fallacy sense, where so often one of the ways in which you try to protect the sciences from being impugned by anybody who might challenge it, right? Like the sort of challenge that I leveled, where I said, look, when you're saying healthy and unhealthy, what are you basing it on? Because you've waded into philosophical waters where we have to actually talk about things like teleology, whether there's a God, the nature of man, how you discern the telos of a thing, and so on. What are you basing it on other than your own sort of declaration as a mental health authority that's what's healthy and unhealthy? And I do think at the end of the day, that really is part of the problem with it, is that rather than recognizing that it's wading into waters that requires sort of deep philosophical investigation and scrutiny, and is not above scrutiny, right? And that in many ways, oftentimes what's identified as healthy or unhealthy is either arbitrary or just reflective of cultural trends.
Yeah.
That, the way you try to bypass that is an appeal to authority. Well, we're the mental health experts, meaning we're the sort of priest class that is able to peer behind the curtain and tell you the mysteries of the universe that are too deep for you, and you need to sort of submit to those types of things. But the fact of the matter is they're not above scrutiny. I mean, what I would say regarding like sleep paralysis, for example, first of all, I would call out the sort of problematic nature of the reductionistic empiricist tendency, right? So you can sit here and identify, the sort of scientific explanation is to say, well, look, we know that the brain, when it's in sleep paralysis, is doing this. And because it's in this state that's sort of between awake and asleep, that tells us that it's purely a mental state, right? Something like that. Now, of course, in the way I phrased that, I conflated mind and brain, which contemporary science often does, which was your point when you asked the question to the doctor, right? Whether it's whether a brain state is a mental state.
Yeah.
And only a reductionistic empiricist would conflate those two. But that usually is the tendency to try to say, because we can identify what's going on in the brain, we've therefore identified the cause. But the problem with that is and therefore, since that's the cause, it's not real, right? You're not seeing shadow people. But of course, the problem is that if you presented to me pie and we were doing a brain scan, you would see how my brain reacts.
Yeah.
And yet we don't follow that to the conclusion that therefore there's no pie, right? Just because the chemicals in my brain react to, the presence of that doesn't mean that there's no presence there, right? So I think the argument itself, the reductionistic argument itself, is fallacious and ridiculous. But the other thing is, and I'm sure you've had stories like this, there are too many stories that just don't fit that interpretation. So I know of stories in which two people have sleep paralysis in the same room and see the same things. And so that's highly problematic if you're going to suggest that it's a hallucination that is purely in one person's mind, right? How do you have these sort of shared hallucinations? The other problem is that the triggers for these are oftentimes spiritual. So I do know plenty of stories in which there's something genuinely like demonic, some sort of demonic encounter, ritualistic encounter, something like that, that occasions that they experience it. And also similarly with that, there's too many stories of people who end up liberated from sleep paralysis, either because they somehow managed to get themselves to invoke the name of Christ. That happens in the documentary The Nightmare. You can find there one of the stories that they talk about. Or other people, like I know people who, after they're chrismated or they, become catechumen or something like that, and they become sanctioned by the church, all of a sudden there's a shift that happens, and they're liberated in some way.
Yeah.
And so the problem is there's just too many markers that say this isn't just a brain state. Right. Like, yes, it makes an impression on the brain. Yes, there's a physical element to it. But again, I think this goes into the sort of false dichotomy that's oftentimes at work, where people think something is either physical or it's spiritual. And if it's a spiritual, you shouldn't see anything happening in the brain, which when you say it out loud like that, you realize that's absurd. Like, why on earth would you think in a world where spirit and flesh are connected, that spiritual things would make no impressions on the body?
Yeah, and I want to get that at the end when we talk about energy. So,
okay. All right.
I mean, it's like when you go outside and you take your shoes off on the ground. If you're plugged up to a brain scan, you're going to see a change in the energy in your body just because you're touching the ground. So that's true of everything. You practically have to be on a brain scan for all these doctors just to get convinced of anything. I convinced a bunch of doctors at the ER one time. This girl was out in the country, and it took 4 of us to get her pinned down and get her into the car. Okay. She was good. She was what Dr. Timothy calls berserk. He calls them berserk. She was berserk. Well, I knew something. This is where you get that gut feeling. Just because I've had it so much, I'm like, okay, here we go. So we got her in the car. Of course, we have to ECO them. So that's the standard protocol. You're going to ECO. That's an emergency custody order. So you got to take them to the ER. They're going to stay in the ER for 4 to 8 hours. They're going to get evaluated by somebody. They're usually not even psychiatrists. They're just trained therapists. And they're going to call, they're going to try to get a TDO on them, which is a temporary detaining order, so that they can ship them off to Petersburg, Abingdon, one of the mental health facilities. So that's what we do. That's the business. And so we got down to the bottom of the hill in Bassett, and she started talking to me. And it wasn't her. It wasn't her. Let's just say it wasn't her. And I said, well, who am I talking to? And she said, Satan. I said, Satan? So I talked to her on the way. But here's the point of what I was getting to at the doc. When I got to the ER, they took her off in the corner of the room. We still couldn't get her down. She had extraordinary human strength, put it that way.
And you're a pretty built guy, I got to say.
Yeah. And I had 3 other guys with me.
Yeah.
So we had to restrain her. And it was a hard time. Anyway, we got her in the ER. Of course, the first thing they do with them is they shoot them up with Haldol. So if you ever had Haldol in your system, you're going out like a light. Like if you and I got hit with it, we'd be out in 5 seconds for 12 hours.
Okay.
So they hit her up twice. It didn't touch her. All right. But here's the weird thing. All these doctors are around her. I'm standing there. She's looking around the doctors. Like, she's looking around the doctors at me. And she's saying to the nurses, get him out of here. Get him out of here. They do whatever. Get him out of here. She's talking about me because I started praying for her en route to the hospital because I knew what was getting ready to happen to her. Well, anyway, all the nurses started calling me Satan for at least 2 months every time I brought in a TDO because they had such a hard time with her, and she kept dialoguing with them about me and not having my presence in there with her. And she still referred to herself as Satan. That was her name at that moment. So I think all the doctors started to realize that this just okay. We can't restrain her. We can't put her out with Haldol. And there's this somewhat weird interaction going on between Deputy Jones and this girl. I wonder what it is. So that just gave me an opportunity to start dialoguing. Well, maybe everything that comes through here is not just a physical malady, and you're ill-equipped to deal with this stuff. Get over it. So that's just one story, I thought.
So let's get back to your story because we marched through pretty quick, right? You marched through how you became interested in it, how this ended up becoming your dissertation, things like that. Yeah. But connect the dots for us in terms of, obviously you've had a lot of practical on the ground experience. I know that is far from the only story you have, the one you just shared. So how did you move from a guy who's writing a dissertation on demonology and studying, theology into law enforcement, and yet also having all these sorts of, obviously you have heavy interaction with the mental health world on the ground as somebody who's in law enforcement. So talk to me, give me a bit more about your story and how all of those pieces come together.
Well, let me just say a kudos to all my law enforcement because most people do not know what they go through on the ground. They deal with this stuff day in and day night. Now, I feel blessed because I had the ability to recognize stuff. Just your average guy, law enforcement officer, he deals with this stuff, but they carry a heavy burden, even when they walk into places that are just evil. So kudos to my law enforcement. But back to my story. I never planned in my life getting in law enforcement. But God had a plan for me. I guess that's part of what Sarah was talking about when she said, just follow God's will and he'll direct you. I got into law enforcement because we moved to Burlington, from Burlington to here, and I couldn't find work. And I asked my wife, I said, what do you think I should do? And she says, well, you're kind of a hard ass. Why don't you just be a cop? Because I'd spent 4 years in the military. And so that's how I got into law enforcement. And I was 45 when that happened. So I didn't plan on it. But I would say this. The plan I was having for myself in the church, and of course this is the Protestant world, never panned out for me. But everything seemed to fall in place when I got into law enforcement. So that's how I got into law enforcement. And I just used the opportunity for everything I experienced from working in the jail, working on patrol, working in investigations, to kind of do my homework for a lot of what I was writing, because words don't teach. Even a person who watches this podcast, words don't teach. Experience teaches. And once you encounter an evil presence, you know.
Right.
I mean, you just know. And I'm at the point now, you can believe me or not, I don't care. You know?
Yeah.
So, well, and what was the rest of your question? I'm sorry, I got off.
No. I think you landed it. Now what I'm curious about I'd like you to do is sort of flesh out for me. You said all the pieces fell into place, right? So you used this as an opportunity to sort of bring the practical side of what what you researched, right? Practice, basically you had done all this research in terms of the spiritual side of what, people are dealing with, in terms of what would typically just they be identified as chemical disorders or something like that.
Yeah.
And then being in law enforcement now, dealing in jails and I presume you have encounters with people who are rehab, all this sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
You started to be actually on the ground with it, witnessing it firsthand. And so talk to me a little bit about what that begins to look like. I mean, obviously I've heard, you've given plenty of stories, but I'm all for more stories, by the way, if you got them. But what does that actually begin to look like in terms of how you see this panning out now? That study converge with what you're doing now.
Well, I don't want to be an alarmist, but it's just getting worse. It's just getting worse. The system is locked in. You can't buck it. If you try to buck it, for example, like the case of Emily Rose. Yeah. And I was thinking about this morning about how we deal with people, because if we could find 50 people who are actually possessed or demonized, well, you're going to call in the Catholics to do an exorcism or something. If you just deal with the mentally ill in our society, they're going to go through the system, right? And if you buck that, I could lose my job. I can't start doing something. Of course, I've done something, but you just can't beat the system. So it's getting worse. It's getting exponentially worse. That's why I said pray for our law enforcement, because they see. Here's the thing. Until I got in law enforcement, it was just all theoretical for me.
Sure.
And these guys, and I'm not just talking about your beat cop, these guys see stuff that causes them to start drinking, suicidal, because you can't unsee this stuff, And I don't think the average layman understands that what they're actually carrying home to their families, stuff like that. It can be a mind-numbing experience unless you got some spiritual backbone about you to know what's going on. So, but back to one of the cases I had, which goes back to kind of like what Sarah was talking about. I think I told you this one. This is on Grace Drive, and it was the middle of the night. Couldn't knock on the door. The door was wide open. All the walls are painted black. There's satanic symbols written all over the walls, right? So that means they had taken time to paint the place. They had taken time to write these symbols down. There were candles lit, and one girl was she was naked in the bathtub. She had slit both wrists. She was bleeding out. The other girl was sitting on the couch, and she was going, oh. So she was like in this trance state. And so we had to take care of the girl in the bathtub first. We had to save her life. But I told my other officers, I said, we're in Henry County. All right. Everyone thinks things happen everywhere else except where you live. I want you to look at this place and see what's going on, because this isn't the only place it's going on. So these are kind of eye openers for people who really they can't process the scene besides just a girl in the tub that's dying. I said, process the scene. There's a reason why that girl's over on the couch in a trance. There's a reason why she's in the tub, slit wrists, naked. And it has to do with the scene we're in.
Yeah.
Explain that to me. that's just kind of how I was rolling at the time with everything we were encountering.
Do you ever get, do you ever get these cases where it's obvious enough that they actually will bring in, an exorcist or something like that? No,
they won't bring them in. Oh, I've seen them. They should have brought them in, but they don't.
Wow.
Because they're in the system. I mean, I had a guy in one jail cell. Clearly, I'll tell you another story. This was in another facility I was working at when I first started. They kind of knew my background because I had put it on my app. So they stuck me in the mental health ward of that particular facility. So this is all the people who commit heinous crimes, psychotic, stuff like that. Well, I remember going into work one day, and I was working with Deputy Legg, and I was doing my rounds, and you got to look in the window and put visual on the person in there and make sure they're okay. You got to do that every half hour.
Okay.
And when I did, and man, this scared the crap out of me. you know how in the movies you're looking in the window, all of a sudden the face just comes up at you.
Yep.
The face comes up at you. And
I'm familiar with it.
Well, when I looked in, that girl, she just popped up and went rah at me like that. And I said, "Oh man, I think we got one." And so I went back because a couple of days in, I mean, she would eat her pencils, eat her pens. You couldn't go in because she'd attack you. Couldn't feed her because she'd just throw the food at you. Her hair's all a mess, feces. You'd have to go in there and strap her down just to clean up the place. Well, I remember telling Deputy Legg, I said, "Here's what I want you to do, Legg, since you don't believe what I'm telling you. I want you to walk up and put your face in the window. Okay? But you're around, go look at it." He came back, the hair on his arms and the hair on the back of his head was standing straight up. And I said, "See, I told you." I said, we got something that someone's dealing with evil in her life. This is a human person, right? We can't just treat her as a subject of investigation. This is a human person. Make a long story short, back to what I was saying about the situation that these people find themselves in. I came into work a couple weeks later, and I said, "Where's she at?" Well, they said they released her. I said, "On her personal recognizance?" They said, "She got out somehow." I said, "She'll be dead in 3 days." That's exactly what I said. "She'll be dead in 3 days." I went straight to the Roanoke Bridge and jumped. And she's no longer with us. But they don't know how to deal with them.
Yeah.
I just don't know how to deal with them.
So this does get to the exact thing that, is part of my, on the long list of gripes that I have with, the psychiatric industry, and candidly with the degree to which Christians and churches have relinquished psychiatric care. I mean, psychological care, right? Like, let's use the word psychological, right? Because, psyche, you're actually here talking about the soul, the care for the soul.
Soul care, yeah.
Which is supposed to be the jurisdiction of the church. Yes. And the fact of the matter is, if you really believe that part of what has gone wrong in the soul is, the fall, the distortion of our human nature, and if you really believe that can only be remedied through Christ, his church, the sacraments, things like that, then inevitably, even if the mental health industry had the right worldview, even if they're like, you know what, there's a God, you know what, there's a proper formation of man, you know what, we have to look at the particular difference of the species, and from that we can discern proper end, which means it has to be the rational side of man, and so on and so forth. And they started to go down a road, and they started to form a broadly, let's not call it a Christian worldview, but something that's in harmony with it, like certain pagan philosophies. you would still have to believe as a Christian that it is deficient because it's lacking the medicine of immortality. It's lacking exorcism. It's lacking baptism, right? It's lacking these things that are the true medicine of the soul. And so the problem that I have several problems with this. Part of it I've already voiced, which is that I think it operates under a faulty worldview of reductionistic materialism. And as a result, it's oftentimes addressing effects as if they're causes. I've got a problem with it in the sense that it, wades heavily into worldview issues, but it pretends that it doesn't. And unfortunately, the worldview it reflects is scattershot at best and wildly faulty. That's sort of the optimistic version of it. And then, the other thing that I have is that even if you could address all of those things and it was open to these other realities, it's ill-equipped to address them, because at best all it has is somebody to sit there and talk to you who doesn't have any sort of spiritual authority and who doesn't have at their disposal the primary tools for the healing of the soul. And so again, I always have to come back to this. I'm not advocating a dichotomy where it's like we pretend that there is no physical component to these things. Obviously we do. It's a bilateral relationship between the physical world and the spiritual world. But in that sense, I think the best version of mental health, the best version of these things would be something in which sort of research that looks at what's going on in the psychiatric world is done in tandem with, a proper worldview, in tandem with the church, right? That the church shouldn't just sort of farm out psychological care for people and say, well, priests aren't equipped to do this sort of thing and so on, so let's have a psychiatrist do it, or a psychologist do it, or a counselor, whatever. That really what you need in order to really remedy those things, you would have to have the church again take the lead, and you'd have to have the church do it in a way where it actually does bring into it becomes in dialogue and in cooperation with some sort of scientific side concerning the physical components as an aid or a supplement, not as a replacement for the care for the soul. But it seems like what I'm hearing, unfortunately, this is depressing, but what I'm hearing, you correct me if I'm hearing you wrong, but on the one hand, I'm hearing that, well, I'll start with what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is that the church has grown more and more comfortable. Churches in general, Christians in general, have become more and more comfortable with saying, well, the sickness of the soul is sort of thing you should farm out to counselors, to psychiatrists, to psychologists, and you outsource it. And they're becoming more and more comfortable with that, as if that's not the job of the church to care for the soul. And yet what I'm hearing from you is that in terms of the mental health industry, certainly in terms of in its most extreme cases, is not only willing to play that role, but it plays it in a way that's actually adversarial to the spiritual realm, because no matter how much evidence comes forward that what you're dealing with is something dark, spiritual, something beyond their jurisdiction, they don't have a concept of beyond their jurisdiction. So the system is set up to make sure that there is no room to bring in the church or the spiritual reality. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And even if it did, you don't want to send them to these guys.
No, you don't.
Because they're just going to do more harm.
Right.
All these deliverance ministries that are out there, they just do more harm. They haven't a clue what they're doing to these souls of people. So I don't know. I'm just kind of.
I'm curious about something. I mean, I know that I recommended to you Timothy Petitsis to read him, and I've had him on the show and interviewed him, and I know you got his book. I won't ask you if you've read the whole thing, because it is a thick read, But yeah, have you been able to dig in? And if so, because he offers plenty of critiques of the mental health industry too. That's part of what the ethics of beauty is about, the missing component of beauty as part of what's important to healing the soul. What do you think of his work? Whatever you've read of it so far?
Well, it's definitely a different way of thinking about everything. Okay. Because he comes at it from an orthodox perspective. It's the section on the triumph of the therapeutic. He was spot on. He's spot on with a lot of the stuff. I haven't disagreed with him yet about anything. I've been trying to actually incorporate that in my thinking now. And I had a thought as I was reading. I remember having this thought. I've actually used that concept when I'm doing an investigation, and I'll tell you how. I had a case one time where these are the most disturbing cases. They're the cases that involve children.
Yeah.
And someone who has maybe sexually violated their person. But anyway, I had my suspect, right? I'm sitting down with him. Got social services next to me because it involved a child. And I have my evidence, right? But the problem with in the courts is it's just hearsay, and it's hard to get a little girl or boy into the testimony stand to tell their story, because that's hard for the child. But anyway, back to what I was saying. So I had this person in front of me, and because I'm a hostage negotiator too, so I use this kind of concept all the time when I'm dealing with a barricade or something like I'm getting ready to tell you. So I had this person in front of me, and you can just sit there and ask him a bunch of questions. But I remember asking this guy, because he was in denial the whole time. I said, is this child, is she beautiful to you? And he just, because what I wanted to do was, I don't want to talk to his mind, just I want to talk to his heart. Because if I can get to his heart, I can get him to confess, right? So I went down that road. I said, is she beautiful to you? Is she good to you? I was using that language of beauty, goodness to truth, right? And I kept on with because I had some notes about memories and stuff like that I was using. And he just fell apart. When I got to his heart, because you can tell if you've studied body language, they're shifting, they're starting to shift, their eyes look a certain way, they start looking up a certain way, but you can tell when you're starting to get to somewhere. So I remember I remember leaning in. You lean in, and I said, "Do you love her?" And that's when it was over. Got the confession, and it kind of snapped out of it. Because now he just realized he confessed to something that's going to put him away for years. But I used his own hearts. Now, I'm not saying he loved her, because evidently what he was doing was not love. But there's still something in there that's in every human being, and it's tied to beauty. Right. I guess I presented him a theophany in his memory, of days gone by that were beautiful, that were good, that I could bring out and use to cause that shame that he talks about. Yeah. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It might have even led to repentant confession, but it led to a confession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me ask, because I've chatted with Timothy Petitsis about this before. I would love to see, and I don't know that it's possible. I don't know on a practical level how you would enact it. I'm all for people becoming inspired and trying to find a way to enact it. But, you talked about the fact that, it's not as if, okay, the mental health industry is flawed in all the ways that we've talked about. So the solution is send them over to, this charismatic folks who over here who are going to do some sort of deliverance ministry, and they're going to mess them up in a different way. Like, that's not what it is. And, I can conceive of what it would be like, right? What it would look like for psychiatric, mental health professionals to work in harmony with the church, for them to recognize, certain chemical sides of things while the church is dealing with confession and sacrament, where there's genuine care for the soul that's holistic, in the sense that if I have a wound, right, that's so unbearable, there is a way to numb it, but that's not the solution, right? The real care for the soul, genuine repentance, confession, restoration, the sacraments need to be done. I mean, I could conceive of a way in which you could see a beautiful harmony between the sort of between what the mental health industry wants to do, right, and what it attends to, with what the church is supposed to do, what it's there to do, and what it's equipped and empowered to do. But I guess I'd be curious, rather than just leveling the critiques, if you could, and I didn't prep you for this, right? So this might not be a fair question, putting you on the spot, but if you could vision cast a little bit based on your own experiences on the ground, right? Like, what would reform maybe begin to look like? What would a reform system that actually sort of recognizes that there's a spiritual component to this, it's not just physical, that is concerned with the healing of the soul, rather than just the chemical castration of it, or imprisonment of it, or whatever it may be. What if you were just given a magic wand to begin to reform it, what might that reform begin to look like, regardless of whether practically we could ever pull it off? I'd be very, very curious.
Well, now that I'm Orthodox, it would involve the Orthodox Church.
Sure.
Not the other churches. Because even in that system, when you got a spiritual problem, you go see the pastor. You come in with a label, you're going back to see the psychiatrist. So, and that's all based on a fee-for-fee service. The whole system's based on a fee-for-fee service payment system. It's a payment system. And a lot of those pastors, they can't deal with stuff. They just can't deal with it. They don't even know what they're doing. But the Orthodox priest can. I can tell you that. He sure can. If I was to wave a wand, I would let the whole culture collapse first. Because it's not until we hit bottom that we recognize our real need. You did all your stuff on the nuns. I got a ton of friends that are, what do they call themselves? Spiritual, but not religious.
Right. The religiously unaffiliated, right?
Tons of them. But they're not going to the church. They're not going to the church. So the systems have to collapse, before you can rebuild something. And I think we're at the point where I was seeing it in the 90s and the 2000s. It started to collapse. It was starting to collapse, but it's that's the way God judges things. If that's what you want, here's what you get. So, and then you got to equip. We got to get more Orthodox priests on the ground, or laymen. I don't even, if I can use that term, just laymen, just talking to people, just being in their life, being an Orthodox Christian, I don't know. Yeah. I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd love to. I mean, you might be right that we have to see it collapse, because I think otherwise the false authority that's there, right? I mentioned false appeal to authority. That false appeal to authority has to become suspect in order for you to get anywhere. And I think it is, right? I think you're starting to see,
you're starting to see it. Yeah.
You're starting to see various ways in which Abigail Shriver or people like Timothy Pacitis on the theological side. There are definitely people who are starting to recognize that, maybe all of our, mental health professionals are not actually up to the task to healing the soul the way they've been commissioned to, and maybe this isn't actually making things better, because the psychological health of people seems to be getting worse, right? People seem to be getting more and more fractured, more and more fragile, more and more broken in various ways, and the promise of psychotherapy isn't delivering. And so I do think you're starting to see that collapse. I guess my concern is, that I don't think I don't think that there is no good to be found in the psychological realm, but it definitely needs to be sifted, and it needs to be wed with, the church, which is the one that's actually entrusted and empowered to heal the soul.
And even if I was thinking this morning when I was getting ready to come on, if I put on a billboard down in town, come here, Dr. Nathan Jacobs, talk about the Nicene Creed, versus come here, Dr. Nathan Jacobs, talk about deliverance from demons. The first one, you'd get 5 people.
Sure.
The second one, you'd fill up the place. So I was thinking about training an army of lay people, because these priests, they would get overwhelmed. What if I showed up at St. Ambrose with 200 people? I mean, I could get them to come. I could get him to come. He'd be overwhelmed. Wouldn't even fit, So I think I might go to we need to focus on training the laity to get out there and start helping these people with the tools they need to get help. And that just means doing what Jesus said in Matthew 25. If your brother has a need, you better help him. And so you can retrain people to say, okay, well, that person is, they don't have to have all the way fallen down and OD'd 3 times to see they have a need. You need to get them before they do the overdose, right?
Right.
Which means getting out of your own little world and doing what Jesus told us to do, and that's hard in our culture. I mean, I've been in Africa 2 or 3 times, and those people have nothing. And they were some of the happiest people I knew, and they had nothing, and we got everything. So maybe some of our toys need to be taken away to wake us up a little bit. Maybe we might be the church of Ephesus, lukewarm.
Yeah.
And Jesus is at the door knocking. Well, you better do what Dr. Patisa says. You better find your eros, your love for Christ, even if it's like St. Moses the Black.
Right.
Even if it costs you your life. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you're touching on one of the other questions I wanted to chat with you about, which was how, obviously you did your research, you wrote your dissertation before you were Orthodox. Yeah. And so I'm curious, not that you have to give the whole long journey, but I'm curious what led you to Orthodoxy, and then also how becoming Orthodox, if at all, has shifted your perspective on the sorts of things that you researched and wrote about in your book. If at all, so I obviously know it has shifted, but
I'll answer the second part, the first part first. So my journey into Orthodox wasn't really a dramatic thing, because everything I was as a Protestant was never locked down. Like I never was really a 5-point Calvinist, because I was running around with free will all the time. I never was locked down with anything, because if you could ask my wife and my friends, Jeff was always unwilling to budge on finding a place that had the Lord's table every week with a real wine and real bread. And that's since the early 90s. That was my heart. And so when I met Father Sam, just like I met you, it was a coincidence, maybe not a coincidence. When I met Father Sam, he had listened to what I was trying to ask him. He said, well, you need to go read St. Cyril's Arguments Against Nestorius.
So just pause there. Yeah. So who is Father Sam, and where did you meet him?
Well, he's at St. Ambrose in Roanoke.
Okay.
That's the Orthodox church. We don't have any Orthodox churches down here.
Okay.
I had to go to Roanoke. And so that's how I met Father Sam.
Okay, but why were you at an Orthodox church?
Well, because I was sick of it all. I was just done. I was done. And I wrote my wife a letter. It said 35 years. That's the title. And I went through I said, I'm done. I'm done with it. I'm done with it. And I just got down. I said, because of my, I basically said this. I said, I got a lot of stuff, junk I got to deal with, and I can't deal with it with these people. They don't know how to treat me. I need a hospital. Cause I'm a warped man, I think we've talked a little bit about that stuff. I was just done with it all. So that's how I found orthodoxy. Father Sam. But he also knew that I was intellectually stimulated. You got to convince me of an argument first.
Sure.
And I was never really satisfied with penal substitution and all that stuff. And when I read that argument that St. Cyril had with Nestorius, I'm like, boom, here we go. And I just started eating it up. Finally, to a point where I became a catechumen and joined the church. Of course, I was in Montana because I was still curious about icons and stuff.
Sure.
Perry Robinson sent me a text and said, quit. He said, don't read all these books and try to intellectually figure it all out. He said, just go to divine liturgy, listen to your priest, go to confession, and just chill for 3 or 4 years. He said, learn how to fast. Do that. So that's how I got into it. The question that was looming in the back of my mind that I had not answered with any of this, none of this, was answered by this guy. His name's Dr. Nathan Jacobs.
Oh.
And it's when we were discussing it at the round table, and I remember texting you after we had left. I said, what is that word you used when we were talking about how evil spirits, demons, actually metaphysically mess with people, right? Because I had an idea, but I really couldn't pin it, And you said it's a spectrum. You remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
And then you said, you want me to just read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I got it here to read. It said, because this answers the second part about my work and what I was going to say about energy. You said, we are porous beings who take in our environment. And that's true, which can either make us thrive or make us sick. Yep. Go drink some bleach. Therefore, in the same way, we live in a spiritual environment, surrounded by angels, demons, and we are susceptible to their energies precisely because we are made to be susceptible to them. They are ministering spirits whose role in the cosmos is to carry the divine energies to us and energize us. Just because angels become corrupt does not mean that we cease to be susceptible to their energies. Therefore, the experience of demons is not an outside influence. Now there goes to my work. I was trying to come up with these names like temptation, vexation, oppression, right. These stages. Right. Yeah. And in my actual experience with these, it's never a stage. Right. It's never demons don't take you from temptation to possession overnight. Right. Go read Son of Sam stuff. Go read Ted Bundy stuff. Go read all these serial killer stuff. They never take you. It always starts in childhood or some other time where you're doing something. All right. Anyway, you said temptation, encroachment, oppression. Versus an inside influence possession. Rather, it's all a spectrum of being energized by them. We can fortify ourselves against the influence by exorcism, emptying the house, baptism, union with Christ, charismation, filling the house, Eucharist, imbibing the divine energies, confession, ongoing purification, asceticism, putting to death the passions by which the demons take advantage, and prayer, lifting the soul to God. However, we are still in that environment, which is why you and I can begin to feel sick from reading a black magic text, like that would happen to me. We are opening ourselves up to spiritual energy, particularly demonic energy, Ouija board. This is a critical feature in Orthodox spirituality. So this narrows it in all for me. This is the critical feature that the Catholic Church, the Catholics, this is their big book, Introduction to the Science of Mental Health, Dominion. This is Father Chad Rippenberg or something. Protestants, this is where they don't get it. Yes, in prayer, we may ask God to do something, heal or show mercy or offer guidance, but we are also opening our soul to God and inviting Him. And conversely, there are energies we can engage that open us up to demonic energies. It is fine to refer to the demonic activities of temptation or oppression. The demons do tempt and oppress. Nevertheless, possession is more a matter of degrees than kinds. And I use that exact line in my book. And I didn't know you, right, when I wrote that. When we open ourselves to the demonic, whether it's truth, indulgent sin, or the Ouija board, we are opening ourselves to demonic energy. And in the most extreme cases, you see demoniacs or demonism who operate synergistically with the demons. It's not the puppet stuff, right? Cooperating with the devil. The single agent acting with his energy and the devil's energy in the single act, like an inflamed blade that cuts and burns simultaneously. In addition, in some cases, the person himself seems to lose himself, and here we get to what is often called possession or some kind of symbiosis. And I'm like, well, there's my answer.
Well, that's a pretty good text, I got to say. You
wrote it, but I had been reading Palamos and David Bradshaw stuff, but I was still trying to answer the question. You read a lot of stuff about evil spirits and the fathers and stuff, but you put it together for me in my mind and how it works, and that's the critical features. The essence energy distinction, but I don't think anyone else has. So.
Yeah, well, and I don't know how many, I can't recall if I've talked about this on the podcast yet. I know that there's an upcoming interview I have with Father Maximus McIntyre that's coming up, Orthodox priest who worked with Ed and Lorraine Warren.
From the script?
Yep, the guy who, from the movie script, They Dwell Among Us.
Ooh.
But so I ended up, delving deeply into demonology myself when working on that project, because I won't say too much about it because that interview will say plenty. But you've read the script, right? I shared it with you twice. Was it any good? Did you like it?
I'm gonna read it again.
All right.
When you go watch movies that deal with this subject, it's always a Catholic priest. Mm-hmm. When you inserted an Orthodox priest, everything changed. Yeah. The whole dynamic of the storyline changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was really the point, right? I mean, part of what I was saying was whenever I'd talk with folks about it in Hollywood, I'd say, like, look, if you've seen The Exorcist, you've seen them all, because it's always Catholic, but there's a different worldview with the Orthodox. There's a different ethos and so on. And so that was part of the hook with them. But it was also based on a real guy, right? On Father Maximus, who I've got that upcoming interview with. But I tell you, you talked about the ways in which these things become concrete. It goes from theoretical to concrete. The metaphysics of it were theoretical before that project. But, using an example like getting sick from reading black magic texts, that's experience, because what started to happen in my own life and in my own world was exactly that, right? The deeper I went into it, the moment I stepped into that project, I saw it. I saw the ways things manifested in my life. I saw some of it was obvious, overt stuff, like people being yanked out of bed, right? Some of it was more subtle, like weird. You talked about these sort of alien thoughts, right? Or what the church fathers would call logismoi, right? These sort of demonic alien thoughts that come in. I started experiencing those sorts of things in the project, but also just the more subtle things, right? That I didn't recognize until in retrospect were probably demonic influence, just looking for ways to take advantage of wherever you're weak and whatever else. But it also included a lot of things like that. I just recognized that at some point when we were doing like test footage and things like that for that project, I refused to let our prop master make like the black magic text. I was like, I'll make the black magic text. And which meant I was reading different black magic texts. I was notating them. I was building them. I was building this prop for a character who was a demoniac. And it made me sick. There was a threshold for like, I can't go any further working on this. Because the thing I'm drinking in is poisonous.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's what it is. And so yeah, now, the reality of that was.
Would you call that the energy?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so part of what I talked about there is I think this is something that not a lot of folks recognize, but I tried to draw out in the script, right? In that movie script. That's why it was called They Dwell Among Us, right? Because it was trying to say, rather than having this sort of two-story universe where you've got the fleshly realm here and then you've got the spiritual realm out there, and every now and then things, come in and out or something like that. Seeing those two worlds as overlapping, one being invisible behind the veil, but they overlap. And I think when you look at the way in which the church fathers, especially the Eastern church fathers, understand the world, they see it in this hierarchical sense of basically, the great chain of being where you have rocks, plants, animals, humans, angels, and things like that. But one of the things that I think is an underappreciated aspect of providence and of anthropology and of angelology and thus of demonology is this feature in which let me approach it this way. On my Substack, I have a couple of different posts on providence, right? A peculiar feature of providence, I think, is one of them. I have a thought on providence. There's a couple of posts that I did on providence that try to highlight this. But I think it's a really underappreciated aspect of theology. When you look at scripture and you ask the question, like, how often does God himself show up directly, right? No intermediary, no prophet, no angel. The answer is pretty rarely, right? It's an extremely rare phenomenon. Now, the tendency, if you think of us as just closed systems where I'm an object, you're an object, and God's an object, then that starts to make you feel as if God is distant, right? Like God is a neglectful father who lives off someplace else, and he'll send a servant to talk to you, but he can't be bothered with it, right? An angel will show up and talk with you, or Moses will show up and talk to you, but he can't be bothered to talk with you.
Right.
But I think what's missed in that is that the normative mode of providence is this idea of synergy. And synergy, this idea that there are energies of God, that you and I have energies that we can give off and another person can take in, is critical to begin to see how that's an inaccurate picture of things. So for audience members, I won't go too deep down the road of energy or energies, but the basic concept was that, any sort of thing, right, has a nature, but it also has energies, expressions, operative powers that exude from it. So the church fathers will oftentimes talk about fire, and then they'll talk about the heat and the light being the energy that exudes from it. And one of the things that they recognize, drawn from St. Paul, and if you want to hear more about this, you can listen to my interview with David Bradshaw. We talk about, this in depth. But one of the things that they recognize is that energies are often communicable. So one of their favorite analogies is that you can put, iron in fire and it'll begin to glow and to burn, and you can remove it. It's still iron, but now it has these foreign energies within it. The heating properties of fire, right, of light and of heat, right, have been communicated to it. So it remains what it is, right? It is still iron. But the energies of a foreign nature have come to be resident within it. So that's the communicable side of the energies. And that begins in Alexandrian Judaism, and then it reappears in Paul. So Paul uses the language not only of energies, but also of synergy, right? telling the Thessalonians that, you are co-workers with God. There he's actually, he's talking about synergy, right? That you and God are both doing the work simultaneously. And he even talks in Ephesians about the children being energized by the devil. So he talks about these sort of synergistic activities with dark forces. Now, the reason that's important is because when you talk about the presence of God or the activity of God being mediated, like the way I described, where God sends an angel or a man or a natural element or something like that. In English language, in our culture, we have a tendency to think of a mediator as someone who creates distance between, like, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer, right? And that means I don't have to talk to you or interact with you. Some proxy interacts with you. But the mediator language in the ancient world, like in St. Paul, this is how John Chrysostom reads St. Paul, where there's one mediator between God and man, who is Christ. The mediator language there actually refers to a conduit, someone who actually joins together two things or brings something else near. Yeah. So you might think of it in the sense of a branding iron, right? If I were to heat up a branding iron, I bring it over to a cow and I burn it. Well, how distant does that fire feel to the cow? Not very distant, right? It's right there. Yeah, and right if there. You answer, and if you ask the question, what's burning the cow? Is it the iron or is it the fire? The answer is both. Right, the fire is what is burning the cow because it's energies that are doing it. Right, that's the expression of the fire. But the thing that brought the fire near is the iron. Right. And I think this is the critical feature that if you look at the nature of providence throughout the Bible, one of the things that you see is that God, the normative mode of providence, is that God tends to operate synergistically. Like if Elijah shows up and heals somebody, well, does that mean Elijah healed them or God? And the answer is both, right? Elijah is like the branding iron who brings it near, but it really is God healing the person. And similarly, if you and I were talking with a saint like Elder Paisios, although he's now reposed, and we had an experience where his face is glowing, right, with divine light, with divine glory, which is something that certain people experience with him. We wouldn't look at each other and go, yeah, he's really great, but where's God? Right? Like we would recognize that what you're seeing there in him is God. We are seeing the divine glory through him, right? In and through him, he has brought God near to us. And what's interesting is I think the normative mode of providence, the way the world is supposed to be, is that if the world had never fallen, is that what you would see is you'd see the angels, you'd see the hierarchy of angels who are obedient servants to God. They would be holy, not because they're holy in themselves, but because holiness is a divine energy. So they would radiate holiness. They would radiate glory. They would be eternal because they'd participate in the divine energy of eternity, which is something Pseudo-Dionysius talks about. The things that we would see in them would be manifestations of God. And the ministering spirits part is the sort of thing that in Judaism and Christianity, they were meant to be people who carry that near, that they mediate that to a creature, that they bring God near. And so, for example, in I think it's Second Maccabees, the Maccabees are energized for war by the holy angel.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of a funny thing. We have a tendency to think of angels can only energize a person once they become demons, but they don't have that capacity when they're good.
Yeah.
But that's not the way the ancient world thought, right? They thought, angels are able to minister to humans and to energize them because that's what they're there to do, right? So the picture, this great chain of being picture, is there in order that the world as it's meant to be is that God energizes and communicates himself, right, to things higher in the chain, the highest order of angels, who carry that to the lower order, who carry that to man, who carries that to the animals and to the plants and things like that. And the whole cosmos is supposed to participate in and be glorified and energized by God, God cascading down through all of these sorts of things. Now, the reason that's important is because when it goes to this question of, things like prayer or things like participation of God, the sorts of things I was talking about in that text, what we have a tendency to, again, think in these very closed system mechanical ways. All that's happening is I'm sending words into the air and I'm hoping that God hears me, and I'm hoping that maybe he does something, right? Something like that. As opposed to recognizing that the very fact that I've uttered the name of God, that I've opened my soul up to God, that I've turned myself to God, right, is already itself something where I, as a porous being, who are made to be energized by God, who is also made to be susceptible to, other energizing spirits like angels, I've opened myself. Something is happening there, regardless of what God does, right? That sort of thing. Right. Just like, and this is one of the reasons why, one of the reasons I brought that up in the text is because I was like, well, that's the same thing that's also happening if you were to engage in an occult ritual. You start to invoke a certain name of a certain spirit that's a symbol that's tied with them. By uttering them, you open yourself up to them. You gauge in the ritual, you open yourself up to them. And the fact of the matter is that you and I are porous beings. Just as organically we live in a world where we're meant to take in air and food and water. We're supposed to process that. And in an ideal state, it would be good for us and it would make us healthy and strong, right? If we're in a toxic environment, you said go drink some bleach, like if you're in a toxic environment, it makes you sick, right? Well, so in the same way, we are made to be beings who imbibe the spiritual energy around us, imbibe the spiritual energy of saints, who imbibe the spiritual energy of the good angels, who imbibe the energy of God, but when you're in a fallen world, right, there is more than just good energy, right? There aren't just angels, there are demons. And the fact of the matter is those demons still can energize you because you as a being are created to be susceptible to their energy. You as a being are made to be susceptible to the energy of other people, right? We're supposed to minister it to each other. And so the fact of the matter is, if I'm interacting with somebody who is a demoniac, there's a good reason why something feels off or feels dark. You talked about it as a gut feeling. And that's our common parlance, but I think it's genuinely that we can feel or detect that dark energy that's exuding. And in a similar way, like when we find objects that have demonic attachments, things that have been energized, right? This is the concept of relics and holy places and, things like that, which that was, again, part of the concept in this ancient way of thinking that the energies don't just rub off from angels to man, but they can rub off to objects. They can rub off to places, right? Christ's robes become conduits for his divine energy. And so that's one of the reasons why walking into an occult store feels dark and weird. And it's not just the decor. There's a reason why if you pick up a black magic text and start reading it, and you're reading through names and symbols and things that have tethers to dark spirits, you start to feel that dark energy and it makes you sick. And there's a reason why if you're interacting with somebody who has a dark demonic attachment, you can feel that dark energy. And so that's the entire point that I was driving at, is that once you begin to look at the world as more of a hierarchy that is an open, porous spiritual system meant to give and take, just like I talked about with the body and the soul, right? The body and the soul has a bilateral relationship where the soul can affect the body and the body can affect the soul. That's the whole cosmic organism. The entire cosmic organism is built in that way, where we're meant to be porous beings. And that's one of the reasons why I was saying that demonic possession, we use that language, but demoniac or demonized is more of the classical language of it. And it's because it's representative of a spectrum. You see certain people like the fortune teller in Acts who seems to have a cooperative relationship with the demon. Right? But then you see obviously other demoniacs who have a symbiotic relationship where they've lost themselves, right? They've gone so far down a destructive path. And that's one of the reasons I was saying it's a spectrum. And that spectrum doesn't just become external, internal. It's not like that, right? If I start to play with a Ouija board, I've opened my soul up, and me as a porous being, I've started to take something in. It starts in those simple steps, and that's why it's more of a gradation. And it is just are they outside of me and doing something to me, or are they inside of me?
And that was a bam.
Well, I'm glad I could help.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the final chapter of my new revision, because that's what answered it for me. So, it's all over the Orthodox literature. You just put it into words for me, because you see it when you read the church fathers and their dealings with the demonics and their own logos me, how they deal with it. I mean, they've been talking about it for 2,000 years. We've just turned it into a science and made a profit out of it. So,
yeah. Well, very good.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap this up?
Well, we've been going a while, hadn't we?
We have been going a while. Yeah.
Well, there's about another 10 holes I could go down, but we can save that for later.
Okay.
There's just different. There's all kind of things that you were saying that I even had questions too. But people need to realize, if you're listening to this podcast or watching the video, we haven't gone down the witches and the warlocks, the covens that are around. They believe this stuff. They'll take a warehouse full of Ouija boards and curse them and send them out. Right. That's why you'll feel that energy. If you're a Christian or something, that, you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they do that stuff. They do it all the time with a lot of things, little trinkets, just like you, and when you were writing in the your movie, just like our relics got power. They send stuff out that do the same thing, and I've encountered that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
and we haven't talked about the poltergeist. And that's everywhere now. Because when I moved in this home, there was a Ouija board up in the bedroom up there, and within weeks, my son started telling me stuff. So,
yeah. Well, what's interesting is, one of the ways in which when I would teach, obviously, if you're teaching like in a group of Christians or something like that, you can start with St. Paul and you can talk about that he uses the word energia, and you can talk about the Aristotelian background and, how it evolves Alexandrian Judaism. But one of the things that I would use as a way of introducing the concept of the energies and the distinction between a nature and its operative powers, and then the Alexandrian development that those operative powers can be communicable, is I would start with a simple experiment like what you just touched on. I'd say, imagine, you bought a new house, you moved in, it's an exciting time, and you realize, oh, the house has an attic. And I haven't explored the attic, and you go up there and you find a satanic altar. And I would always hear, like, you could just hear the air gets sucked out of the room.
Yeah.
And this is in a secular classroom, right?
Yeah.
And then I just asked, like, so what would you do with it? Would you take it downstairs, use it as a coffee table, brush it up? Like, what would? And inevitably, somebody would always say, I'd burn it.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, why? It's just a coffee table, right? And what's interesting is, our culture has this weird dichotomy because of its Protestant roots, which is, heavily sort of, it's Protestant and modernist roots, which is heavily skeptical about things like relics and, all things Catholic, right? Not to suggest that those are uniquely Catholic, but, all things that have an air of Catholicism to them, relics, holy places, things like that. Yeah. There's this tendency to think that God and spiritually good things, don't have any sort of material conduit ever, right? That it's all just sort of me and God mentally, engaging with him. But yet there's still this primordial memory of spiritual energy and attachment with regard to dark stuff.
Right.
And so the funny thing is, even people who are like, I don't believe in relics, I don't believe in holy places, whatever, they step into certain houses, they're like, man, I think this house is haunted. Right? They encounter certain dark objects like a Ouija board or something that seems to be a genuine satanic object or a satanic altar. They just feel there's something there that just connects where they're like, there's something not right about this thing. And they feel it. And so it's energy. It's interesting that the memory, that sort of primordial memory and intuition about spiritual energy is still present with regard to dark stuff. But people never sort of take that step over into the light side and say, well, maybe the reason that objects and places and people can have dark attachments is because people, places, and things are made to be energized spiritually. And so maybe they could also have good spiritual attachments and be energized. And I remember you saying, when I dropped the word paranormal at one point, you had mentioned that you're like, well, in my mind, that's like that's a neutral term because it could refer to things that are spiritually dark or spiritually good.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point, because that really is, at least I think for some people, the starting point to recognize, well, hey, if I think there really are sort of dark attachments to places, to people, to things, maybe the reason those dark attachments, maybe the reason demons can do that is because angels, generally spirits, have the ability to do that. And maybe it's possible that there are people who can give off positive spiritual energy. There are good angels that can do that.
Of course.
And maybe the energies of God himself, that's when you're encountering holiness. And maybe that's an extension of God's own energies of holiness and goodness, all the rest.
Yeah, because everyone's got their angel.
Mm-hmm.
I've got mine.
Mm-hmm.
You want me to tell you a story?
Sure.
Okay. I know we're running long. So we're down at Holiday Lake. Ben and Gabe and Zach are swimming. They're real little, right? It's July 4th. It's hot. It was a man-made lake. There's a high dive out in the middle of it. So you had to walk down the dock to get to it. I had just gotten Gabriel out of the part of the lake where the kids go, right? And he had on those little, what do you call them things? Those little,
the floaty arm things.
So I took him up to the towel and I said, Gabe, you stay right here. Don't move. I'm going to get Ben and Zach. So I went and got Ben out, and I'm walking down the dock to get Zach, and time froze for me. Now, this is just how I tell the story, because this is how I experienced it. Time froze. And I remember Zach running off the diving board, and time just went, and I felt this hand on my shoulder, turned me around, right? And kind of gave me a little push. And then it's like the movies. Then we're back in the real time now. Zach, he's going off the diving board. Well, I look over in the corner of the dock, right around 3 or 4 foot, and I see these 2 little hands going down in the water.
Mm.
All I could see was the hands from here down. Yeah. Now, all I knew is there's a kid in there with 3 teenagers standing right next to him, and he's going down because it's a man-made lake, so it goes like this, and then it just drops.
Right.
So I remember 1, 2, 3 steps. I'm jumping off that deck. I get in the water, and I get down and get that kid up, and guess who it was?
Who?
It was Gabriel. It was my son. And if I would have kept going down to get Zach, I'd have never found him. So that's my angel. That's one of my angel stories. But I'm just saying, I just tell that because they're there, and when they need to show themselves, they'll show themselves. So
on that, maybe this is a good thing to wrap up with. I know from experience that going too far down into the dark side of things can be detrimental to your soul, right? You can imbibe a lot of spiritual dark energy. You can open yourself up to things. It definitely wreaked havoc in my own life. And that was me with taking precautions. Like, I'm still going to go have my house blessed. I'm going to, do confession. So I had sort of tools to counteract it. But I mean, it's dark stuff.
It's dark.
And so the question maybe for folks who are sitting here and going, like, what do I do with this? There's obviously some sort of, there's such a thing as an unhealthy fascination with it. But I've also seen on the flip side people who are like, well, I'd rather pretend it's not there. And there's sort of this oddity. Yeah. There's this oddity that a lot of people think if I just pretend demons don't exist, they'll leave me alone, which is not true. They'll just find more subtle ways to, try to dismantle you. Yeah. And so the question becomes, what do you think on a practical level is the sort of balancing act between, on the one hand, being cognizant of this, right? Like being aware that, that we're in a spiritual world that's spiritually porous, and yet not giving to the demons an undue attention, fascination, interest, and things like that. What does it look like to actually live in a way that is spiritually aware of, the invisible realm, without, without at the same time falling into either ditch, right? And trying to ignore it, hoping that it'll leave you alone and therefore be practically non-existent, or on the other hand, becoming sort of unduly and unhelpfully and unhealthily interested in it.
What was it that C.S. Lewis said in Screwtape Letters about over fascination?
Right. He talked about he talked about the sort of balancing act between, between the scientist, who demons like the scientist, materialist who thinks they don't exist, as much as, the warlock who is, unduly fascinated. It's, something along those lines.
Well, so I'm speaking now as an Orthodox, so everything's changed for me. I would leave I take the advice Perry gave me. Leave the thinking about it realm to the fathers. Don't get overly involved in thinking about them, because they'll drag you in.
Yeah.
Find out what's in your life that's actually a conduit for them messing with you. I would do that. And you're going to do that with your spiritual father. Yeah. You need to do that. And I can give you a list on things. You just need to go through that. Remember that first confession. You need to ask God to give you good insight into a lot of things, because things might still come up later. Yeah. But don't be overly and then just believe what the scriptures say about it. Just believe that it's real. If you're trying to prove stuff, well, guess what? You're going to find out eventually that this is the real world we live in. And if God could open up our eyes to see everything, it would be heaven at one spectrum and it'd be hell on another. And God, what was that I was reading? I think it was was it St. Moses the Black?
Yeah, one of the desert fathers where
he got his eyes open, and on one end he saw the glory of the angels, and then he saw the blackness of the demonic realm, and he was told, this side's got more, this side wins, and all you need to do is learn how to fight your own fight.
That's right.
You remember? I was saying, am I correct?
I remember the story.
Yeah. So, and then just live simply. Learn what Dr. Patisa said. Learn to find, if you're lukewarm, you better start burning, because we live in a time where we need red hot flames that are people say they're willing to die for Christ, right?
Some do.
Yeah, they say that. But if we ever got encountered with anything like that, that's going to be the test of your faith. And so look for the beauty in everything. That's what I'm trying to learn how to do now, is just find that theophany of the day.
Yeah.
And find that goodness and just keep things in mind.
Yeah.
Say your prayers. Fast. It's real simple. I wish I had this 30 years ago, because I'm a military guy. Just do what they tell you to do.
Yeah.
It's been tested for 2,000 years. Yeah. Just do it. And God will, he'll be there with you.
Yeah.
He'll be there with you.
It is rather fascinating because once you dig into the Desert Fathers and people like that with regard to the demonic, what you find is that the remedies are pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
Well, you should fast and put to death your passions. You should pray and lift your soul up to God. Obviously, all of that's supposed to start with, baptism and chrismation and confession and the Eucharist, all of that. And usually, to your question, like pay attention to the things that are conduits. It's most of us, well, I wouldn't say this. They're the obvious sins that we have, that are the conduits, that are the footholds in our lives for the demonic. But this is also the part of what the fathers recommend is, the fact of the matter is one of the reasons they spend so much time in the desert alone with their soul and dealing with the things that are in there is because there's a lot more underneath the obvious stuff. And that's really the best way to deal with it, And of course there are resources, if you're in a house that's got demonic activity, have it blessed by a priest and things like that. Yeah. But most of the spiritual day to day is, it's the boring stuff. It's the stuff of actually learning to put to death your passions and pray and take refuge there. That's how you fortify your soul. So,
but I would also encourage people to, now this is just, Dr. Captain told me, he wrote a book, 2004. It's called One Nation Not Under God, The End of the American Dream. And in that book, here's why I think he's like Francis Schaeffer. He was saying stuff that's like years ahead. He said in the year 2020, and then he went through a list of things that are going to start happening.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, how did he pick that date? Mm-hmm. How do you say it? But what he was saying, because his view was as because he told me in class one time in 1990, he said, Jeff, Satan's demons have been unleashed. I said, what do you mean by that? He said the fallen angels gain power when social order deteriorates. And he said, get ready. And, I'm always a young man then. You think, okay, well, do I go read the newspaper? No, he said, no, it's just going to take some years to see what comes to fruition. But I personally think we're at that point now where we don't get blindsided by what's coming ahead because it might be some things that are going to test our faith. Mm-hmm. So, well, on the larger scale, that.
Yeah. Well, on that happy note, I appreciate you coming on, Jeff.
Jesus wins.
Yes, so. That's true. I do believe that. So, yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, Jeff. I appreciate you joining me and sharing about your story and about your book and all the rest. And I look forward to seeing the new edition when it comes out.
Yeah. Well, you got to help me write it. Okay. I got to come see you.
All right. Sounds good.
But thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it. And maybe one thing that you or I said will touch a spark in somebody and it'll move them towards what we've been talking about. Yes, sir.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.